So once you start thinking enough about the metaphysics of mind and about the general structure of the universe or multiverse, basically all of the common sense possibilities fall away. There's nothing left that coheres with our ordinary understanding of how things could possibly be. And we don't have the epistemic resources to figure out which of these various bizarre things is really correct. So that's the general idea of the book, which I'm developing, over the course of a whole book. And let me just mention one piece of empirical evidence for this general picture, which is relevant to the optional thing that I had Kevin send around. One piece of empirical evidence for this general picture is that if you look at the entire history of philosophy in the world, there has never been a metaphysical picture that's developed in detail and that confronts kind of tricky metaphysical questions like the relationship between the mind and the body and how mental causation works and the size and structure of the universe. There's never been a picture that's well developed along those lines that isn't both bizarre and dubious. No one has ever come up with a coherent, common sense picture of the mind and its relationship to the world and the general structure of the world. And in fact, the people who try hardest to get really rigorous about it end up with the most bizarre pictures, right? Like if you think about who works really hard at this, one example is Leibniz, right? He really goes into detail in this kind of stuff, and he really works on the formality of it, and it is very strange, right? David Lewis, same thing, extremely strange stuff once you really get into the details of it. He's another example of someone who's really rigorous about it. Another kind of case in the Buddhist tradition, people who are talking about the metaphysics of dependent origination and no self and all that. That is really bizarre stuff. So I forget, I think I was going to toss out 4 examples. I forget what the 4th one was that I was going to mention. But, Kant was the 4th one I was going to mention. All of these, very bizarre, right? So if you look at the history of philosophy in every culture in the entire history of the world, no one has ever done it. No one has ever come up with a coherent, commonsensical, here's how things work. And I think there's a good explanation for this. It's not that we could and no one wants one. I mean, there are people who would love to be able to be the common sense philosopher, like Thomas Reid, right? Is like the big champion of common sense in the history of philosophy. Right? He's called a Scottish common sense philosopher. Even he couldn't do it. G.E. Moore, famous for his defense of common sense, couldn't do it. Wittgenstein, gave up. He doesn't have a positive metaphysics. So, right. So, one possible explanation for why everyone fails and you can never do it is that common sense is incoherent, right? If our common sense picture of the world is actually self-contradictory, then you couldn't get a detailed, non-contradictory metaphysical cosmological story that adheres to all of it, because you can't adhere to every aspect of a contradictory set of beliefs without yourself being contradictory. So I think that empirical evidence about the history of philosophy is best explained by the incoherence of common sense, which then in turn explains why all of our future and current attempts will also violate common sense somewhere. So that's all on universal bizarreness, why every theory has to be bizarre. I haven't yet got into the dubiety side of it, but maybe we could talk about the bizarreness side first.
Could I ask, when a philosopher is trying to create sort of this common sense, conception of the world or of metaphysics, what could like an example of that be, just to help understand how that might be contradictory with itself or something? Like maybe a brief example, because I'm struggling to even
imagine what we're talking about
of what that might be. Yeah.
Let me walk you through what I call the dualist's quadrilemma, right? So a quadrilemma, a dilemma has 2 horns, right? Both of which are unappealing. A quadrilemma has 4 horns. So, some people think that dualism, which is the idea that there's an immaterial soul and there's a material reality, some people think that that's common sense, or maybe more common sense than other alternatives like materialism. So think about, so if you try to develop this picture in detail, you get forced into one of four views about the immaterial soul. Here are the four possible views. Each of them are horns because they're all unappealing in some way, right? One is the view that only human beings have immaterial souls, right? This is Descartes' view, for example. Only human beings do. The soul is the locus of consciousness and thought and feeling and all of that. Only human beings have it. Dogs, apes, they might seem like they have it, but they in fact do not have souls. There's nothing it's like to be a dog or an ape. They're all blank inside. They're just empty machines, no more conscious than a toaster. Right? That's horn one. You can say that, right? So you say immaterial souls only attach to humans. That's it. Right? Another horn, you could go all the way to the far end. You could be what's called a panpsychist. A panpsychist thinks everything in the universe is conscious, right? So you could say, oh, no, everything has a soul. The soul is everywhere. Even protons, got this tiny little bit of experience in them, right? That's panpsychism. And actually, this view's recently been getting a lot of attention in philosophy, right? So you could either say only humans have soul. You could say everything has a soul down to fundamental particles, right? Now let's think about the middle, right? There are two ways of being in the middle, right? One is you could have a bright line. You can say, oh, yeah, right. Dogs have souls and gorillas have souls and protons don't. And there's a bright line right in the middle. And the problem with that is that the phenomena that you're trying to talk about are continuous, right? So let's say the bright line, would the bright line be between like a toad of one genus and a very slightly less complex toad of another genus? You say, okay, well, look, this toad has a soul, this toad doesn't, right? But they might be like almost arbitrarily close to each other in terms of their behavior, their physiology, right? It's a smooth continuum in development, in evolution. It doesn't seem very plausible there'd be a bright line in which smack, here comes the soul. Right. So the other way of being in between is to say, oh, well, it's a smooth gradation, but having a soul is a smooth gradation, right? So a human has 100% soul, and a dog, maybe a dog has an 81% of a soul, right? Or a kind of lower, like half a soul, right? But souls seem to be, right, the way people usually think of them, either something you have or something you don't. It seems like whether you've got an immaterial soul, that's like you belong to a special metaphysical category in virtue of that. It's not like a soul isn't a thing that you kind of have or that you can have a fraction of. So those are your four choices. If you think they're immaterial souls, you gotta, if you look at all the philosophers of dualism, they either don't address the question or they take a bizarre answer about it. They have a bright line answer like Descartes does and like Catholicism does, Orthodox Catholicism, right? Right, so that's the kind of thing, right? Once you get into the details of like what would it be to have a soul, you find yourself forced into saying something that was going to be very strange seeming to common sense.
And all these ideas are presupposing someone's belief in the soul as being, well, one, existing, and then two, being a purely metaphysical, non-physical entity, right?
That's correct. So this is all within the option of being what's called a substance dualist. Right? So a substance dualist is someone who thinks there's an immaterial soul that's distinct from the material world. So there are other options. You could be, for example, a scientific materialist. You could say, look, there's no immaterial soul. We're all just made out of fundamental particles swirling in the void. And then you face different kinds of dilemmas. Actually, you face something somewhat parallel to the immaterial soul, the dualist quadrilemma. I think it's not quite as sharply tricky, but I do think it is actually tricky. Where do you say consciousness arises in a material system? It's not totally obvious. I have a paper about this called "What Is It Like to Be a Garden Snail?" Like, how do you decide by scientific criteria whether garden snails are conscious? We don't have a consciousness meter that we can put up against the side of a garden snail and say, oh, yeah, something that's like to be a garden snail. They got conscious experiences. So I think there's a problem there. I think there are other problems with common sense for materialism. One thing I've argued in a recent paper, and it'll also be part of the book, is that most materialist views, if you look at the details, end up committing, even though their authors don't want them to, end up committing to the United States as a country literally containing conscious experiences over and above the experiences of the people who live within it, right? So if you think about what materialists tend to say is essential to mentality, consciousness, is complex information processing, complex functional reactivity, organized, intelligent responding to the environment. The United States, conceived of as like this group entity with people as its parts, kind of like cells in your body, right? In fact, does a huge amount of information processing, is very responsive to its environment, right? It protects its borders, it negotiates trade pacts, it monitors space for asteroids, it imports goods, exhales waste, right? You think about it kind of like an organism, it's a pretty intelligent one, and it meets most criteria for consciousness that materialists have devised. So depending on what kind of top level view you're drawn to, so dualism or materialism being the two best known versions, right? You end up having to make theoretical decisions just a little bit farther down the line where you get stuck with these dilemmas, trilemmas, quadrilemmas, where each horn is pretty radically counterintuitive.
Now, you had said that this is in regards to this, what you had spoken on is how it sort of has to be bizarre, right?
That's the bizarreness thesis, the universal bizarreness thesis.
Yeah, so maybe we can kind of dabble in the dubiety one as well now.
Right. So we'll do that now. The other main thesis is a universal dubiety claim. Right. So this claim is that every moderately well specified metaphysical and cosmological view is dubious, by which I mean we're not epistemically compelled to believe it. We probably shouldn't have a whole lot higher than 50% credence. And the reason for it, the reason for universal dubiety, is that basically when it comes to theories at this order of magnitude, we really only have three epistemic tools to deal with. This is what makes philosophy hard, right? We have common sense, right, which I've already said, based on universal bizarreness, we already know, I think, that common sense is a pretty unreliable guide. It doesn't mean it's no guide at all, but it's certainly not going to be trustworthy because it's going to be contradictory at its foundation. We've got common sense, we've got empirical science, and we've got something like elegance, theoretical elegance, a priori beauty, simplicity, stuff like that. Basically, we've got theoretical, abstract theoretical virtues. Those are the three ways we have to try to figure these things out. Okay? So, can we figure out these questions by means of empirical science, by means of abstract things, abstract theoretical virtues like simplicity? Well, I think we can rule out some theories on all three grounds. So here's a theory that stinks, right? On your 18th birthday, you get an immaterial soul for 17 seconds, after which you never again have a soul, right? That theory has no virtue by common sense standards. There's no scientific evidence that seems to suggest that it's true, right? And it's theoretically inelegant, right? So I think we can flush that one down the toilet, right? Good. We can rule that one out. But take a view like, I'll choose an extreme example, which not a lot of people believe, because we don't have a whole lot of time, but we can develop this more if you want. Take a view like Berkeleyan idealism. According to Berkeleyan idealism, there is no material world at all. All there are our minds and God's mind. He's a theist. Our minds and God's mind all kind of coordinated so that we have kind of matching experiences. Or if you like, the Matrix is probably a good parallel to this, right? So God is kind of like the computers in the Matrix, right? We've got all these immaterial souls floating around, right? And when I decide that I'm going to say something, God arranges it that you guys have the auditory experience of seeming to hear me say it. but there's no actual like material world underneath any of that, right? So this is Berkeley, it's called metaphysical idealism, right? There are only minds and their ideas, right? So there's a famous attempt to refute this by Samuel Johnson. He walked down a street and he kicked a cobblestone and he said, "Thus I refute Berkeley," right? And you know, that's about as good an empirical refutation of Berkeley as you could get. But of course, there's no empirical refutation at all, because Berkeley would be, well, of course, right? Here's what happened. God detected that you made the decision, I'm going to kick this stone. And then God inserted in you the feeling of your toe stubbing up against the stone. Right? This does not prove there's any mind-independent stone out there, right? Berkeley is completely unsurprised. No one who's at all attracted to metaphysical idealism would find this to be a decisive proof. Like, what are you going to do? Like, run a particle accelerator? That's not going to do any better than kicking a stone. You know, Rudolf Carnap says, "Oh, what are you going to do? Like, measure a mountain?" You say, the mountain is this many meters high, therefore Berkeley's wrong. No, right? Idealist. You could convert all of this into idealism. Or if you like the matrix, you can convert it all into the matrix. There's no test that you could run in a well enough designed matrix that would prove that you're in a matrix as opposed, or that you're not in a matrix, right? If someone says, well, we might be in a matrix, there's no test that you can prove that couldn't be somehow devised from within, inside a matrix. So I think there are various metaphysical and cosmological views, including what's sometimes called the simulation view, that we live inside a computer simulation, that in fact straightforward scientific empirical testing cannot refute. So it's complicated. We can get more into it, right? But I do think that when you get into the grandest scale cosmological and metaphysical theories, they run beyond what can be scientifically shown, right? And likewise, our third thing, theoretical elegance, right? This is always kind of a matter of balancing things. It doesn't usually, it can get you decisive refutations of things that are needlessly stupid and complex. But, you know, there's a lot of elegance actually to Berkeleyan idealism, or Kant's view, Kant's transcendental idealism, which I could get into a little bit if you want, but I think is also an interesting, attractive view, right? They have some theoretical virtues. So I don't think you can actually come up with decisive evidence based on science, theoretical virtue, or common sense that that ought to resolve convincingly in favor of one or another big metaphysical cosmological picture. So that's the kind of general defense of the universal dubiety thesis. So the picture we end up with at the end is this picture in which the world is this kind of something weird has to be the case. Something really weird, strikingly contrary to common sense. But we can't figure out what weird thing is true. We can wonder about it, but we can't actually resolve it.
I had one more question as well too. You mentioned in the reading Leibniz's windowless monads 2 times, and I'm not familiar with that. Could you explain that?
Right. Have some people here taken the Leibniz class? Yeah, there's a few people who've taken the Leibniz class, so they might know Leibniz better than I do, because I'm not a Leibniz scholar. But the general, and he's open to multiple interpretations, right? But the general idea of windowless monads is that what you have is you have these kind of fundamental particles. Some or all of them have minds, you know, and there's some debate in the Leibniz scholarship whether it's some or all, right? You got these fundamental particles that align themselves in pre-established harmony. They're windowless in the sense that there's no causal influences into or out of them, but they're all arranged so that everything happens by God's hand, planned in advance, so that they all kind of swirl according to God's plan. So you yourself, right? Your mind is one monad, maybe, right? Your body is a whole bunch of monads. Fundamental particles. They have no causal interaction with each other, and yet they all swirl together to kind of constitute the form of you and your body doing what you think you're doing, and so on for the whole cosmos. So it's a very, actually, pretty strange picture. That's one orthodox interpretation of Leibniz. He's actually pretty tricky.
I have a question, Professor. Um, like most things I say within the field of philosophy, probably shouldn't be taken too seriously, but all the same, I'll pose it. I guess if we were to take your kind of two twin theses here, and let's call that a sort of quasi system, um, what would um, what would stop one from saying that this quasi system, so to speak, is not itself an even more bizarre worldview and subject to dubiety and so forth, more so than any of these other kind of more traditional systems? Like, isn't it stranger to say that we must settle with a strange point of view rather than just going ahead and settling with one that, you know, many people before us have, or to, so to speak, settle with basically an epistemological whatever at the end of the day, right? Rather than settling with one of the other kind of more established notions, even if we acknowledge that, yeah, there could be some difficulties at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. So, does universal bizarreness and dubiety apply to this theory itself? I'd answer those questions differently. So the bizarreness thesis is just an empirical claim about common sense or ordinary people's opinions as they exist now. So the content of the view is that something bizarre must be true. Now, is that itself a bizarre thing to say? I actually don't think it is bizarre, but maybe. I mean, it could be bizarre. And if you think that's a bizarre thing that people think, no, of course, common sense must be right. That's just what everybody thinks, that the common sense view of the world has to be right. Then, I think I disagree with you, but it doesn't matter too much, right? I don't mind if this is a bizarre view among the many bizarre views. There are many. I mean, for sure, we've got scientific views that are bizarre, and yet we know them to be true. Like, for example, relativity theory, special relativity, the twin paradox, for example, is bizarre. The idea that the faster you go, the slower the slower you move in time. That is totally bizarre, right? And yet it's correct, right? And in fact, like heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth travels around the sun, was quite bizarre in its time when it was first proposed. But it's correct, or approximately correct, and it no longer even strikes us as bizarre, perhaps. Claim is itself bizarre. I'm not sure it is. I'm inclined to think that it's not everyone might agree with it, but I don't think people would say it's bizarre to think that the universe is bizarre. On the dubiety side, so my case for dubiety is a negative case, right? It's that we cannot get positive knowledge of which thesis is correct by any of the three main means we have to address them. So I think that the universal dubiety claim is probably true. I'm not 100% confident it's true, but I do think that it is likely to be true, right? And it's not meet the criterion of being dubious, if dubious means like less than 50% likely or something like that, right? And the reason it's different from these other theses is that these other theses are positive claims about some particular thing, some particular structure about which we don't really have a good measuring methods. For example, if you think science is the most promising of the three methods, which I'm inclined to think, a positive claim that we have scientific evidence that Berkeleian idealism is false, or that we don't live inside the matrix, or that there's more than one universe, or that there's only one universe, or something like that. Those positive claims are dubious. But what that means is that the negative claim that that there's nothing that is undubious is supported. So I think it's epistemically different in that respect from a positive claim about what the structure must be.
Maybe this is pretty metaphysically like sacrilegious for me to propose, but is there any value, do you think, in kind of assuming common sense theories to maybe get somewhere else as far as like humanity goes? So like, for example, in like logic, you might say if A then B, but if B then C, and so on and so on. You could go forever. Now we've proven all this stuff, but all we have to do now is prove A, that initial theory. And if so, we've made massive leaps and bounds into maybe what we know metaphysically, what exists, and the laws of nature, and so on. Is there some value in just let's assume A, let's assume that first thing for now, and let's just kind of see where it goes? Is that like a valid way to think about this, at least?
Yes. In fact, that's exactly what I want to do. So I think that the thing to do as a philosopher, if you accept universal dubiety and universal bizarreness, is to do exactly what Kevin just suggested, which is to say, well, it's still interesting to pursue various theoretical options contingently upon making certain assumptions. So what it does is it opens up, I call this disjunctive metaphysics, right? So a disjunction in logic is a sentence that's got ors in it, right? So this is the case, or that is the case, or that is the case, or that is the case, right? So what I think we, as metaphysicians, we're justified in thinking that some big disjunction of possibilities is the case. And then we can explore each of those disjuncts, each of those options in detail if we want. And that enterprise is licensed and encouraged, I think, by the fact that we can't just say, well, of course, everybody knows scientific materialism is true. Why bother to explore the idea that we're living in the matrix, or the idea that dualism could be true, or the idea that Kantian transcendental idealism could be, but I don't even bother with that stuff. We all know that's false, right? I think what's really interesting is to take or panpsychism, right, is to take the kind of neglected options that we can't totally rule out because we're not licensed in high confidence in kind of scientific materialism, say, as the default position. We're not licensed in that, right? So now there are these other options that are kind of open that we might have thought before were closed. Maybe we also thought they were closed because they were so bizarre and contrary to common sense, right? Like panpsychism, right? That is so bizarre, right? But like, well, we violate, even a materialist has to violate common sense somewhere, right? The materialist might think the United States is literally conscious. That's not like less bizarre than panpsychism, right? So you can't rule out something like panpsychism or Berkeleyan idealism or something like that because it's bizarre, and you can't rule it out because you know for sure that some other thing is true. So that then licenses you, I think, and justifies and encourages you to explore these kind of neglected disjuncts. So like in my book, that's part of what I do. So I have a chapter, for example, that I'm working on called, and it's based on a paper that I already published, called Kant Meets Cyberpunk, right? Fiction genre and the idea of the matrix and some other related ideas to explore a kind of hypothetical situation in something in which something close to Kantian transcendental idealism is true, right? Where on the picture that I'm exploring in that chapter, basically, we seem to live in this material world, but beneath the material world is some structure, maybe a computer structure, that's very different from the world as we experience it. And in fact, because computation does not have to be material, you can do computation simply with states that evolve over time. And this follows from the Turing definition of computation. Because you can do computation in, say, immaterial souls if they existed, the computer that runs this simulation that we could all be in might itself be an immaterial thing, like an angel, right? So we could all be like simulated computational entities within an immaterial angel's mind. Now, I don't think that's very likely, but I think it's an interesting to explore. Sorry. Can you hear me? I bumped a cord somewhere and something happened to my video and audio. But you
Yeah,
can hear me?
I can hear you. We can't see you currently, but yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I don't know. I'm trying to start my video again, but something happened. Anyway, so maybe we'll start or maybe we won't.
The Matrix is upset at you.
I guess so. Yes. Right. It was like when I was in China and the bus driver started criticizing the Chinese government, and then suddenly his microphone died. Like, oh. All right. So my video doesn't seem to be working for some reason. My computer is doing some strange things. So, but if you can hear me, that's fine. So, right. So the idea is
We may have lost audio now as well.
Rip. Type in the chat if you can hear us.
Yeah. Well, just type the rest of your talk in the chat now.
Can you put a PDF of your book in the chat now?
Yeah. We'll give him a sec, see if he's able to figure it out.
hello.
Yeah,
Am
we
I
can
back
hear you.
now?
What was that joke earlier about having a soul for 17 seconds?
Yeah.
Your Zoom connection only lasts for like 40 minutes of the meeting.
Yeah.
You know, Schwitzgebel knew too much. The Matrix had to take him out.
Yeah, the entity once known as Schwitzgebel no longer exists.
Just erased from all like scholar articles.
He may have to just restart entirely his computer or something. We'll see if he's able to figure it out.
Okay, wait. So let me try to like understand this. So we're on like crap. So we're like material. It's not material metaphysics exactly, but it's like the understanding of like the soul, which reminds me like Adam like for Harmer's class. So just like it has to be bizarre for any concept of like material or the soul to interact with materialism. Did I get that right? Anyone else understand?
I think I get where
Exactly.
you're going. It's kind of weird if you believe in like a mind-body dualism type thing, similar to the issue or the mind-body problem, right? That arose
Yeah.
with what
Descartes.
Descartes or something, right? Like how do these two worlds interact? Perhaps to just assume that they do in any capacity is just automatically just bizarre, right? It seems as though the
Yeah, and I
idea
want
that
to
he's
pull
trying to say.
Wittgenstein and just be like, what the hell is the soul still? 'Cause I don't feel like it's ever well defined.
Yeah, I guess it depends.
Consciousness?
It depends is like I had asked at the beginning, because this is important to me sort of in this all presupposes a belief in the soul or the mind, body dualist thing, and that not a physicalism idea of the world. But then I guess, as Schwitzgebel was saying, it seems as though physicalism has its own contradictions as well. I don't know. I'm more physicalist than anything, so I'm just like,
same.
physicalism, go. There's nothing wrong with my ideas.
I see no issue yet because I haven't read enough literature.
Yeah, so I'd be curious maybe if Schwitzgebel comes back to life, we can ask him for some of those. Then again, that's sort of out of the bounds of what he was discussing in this in the reading that he sent. If anyone did that, I did a little bit, and sort of what his goal is he's presupposing that idea of the mind body, the dualist conception of the world.
Yeah.
Whereas, I don't know.
I know compared to like Spinoza's like single everything is one, or is that Leibniz?
Yeah.
Something like that.
I also wanted to ask him too. I don't know if anyone else knows what this is. So he mentioned Leibniz's what was it? Windowless
Windowless
monads.
monads.
Yeah, another one that he mentioned as being more fun than common sense was crap, I lost it now. I'm scrolling through. It was like Nietzsche's something. Let me try and find it. It sounded interesting.
Mention the eternal recurrence, right?
Yeah, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence.
Oh,
I don't know
wait,
what that
that's-
is either,
That
despite
shit's
me.
fun.
Yeah. Do you know, can you explain that, Nick?
Yeah,
Do
I
you
had to
know
write
enough?
a 6-page essay for Woods for that. Essentially, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is like whatever action you commit now, or whatever you do, you'll live the same life like over and over again, like Groundhog Day, but you don't have an option in changing what you do. So it's kind of an enforcement to like whatever action you make, it'll be action be done infinitely. So you should have like no regrets in your actions. And it's like goes almost far to like the love of fate in some sense.
Like that we're not allowed to have regrets, or that
That
he's saying,
you should live life with no regrets.
oh, I see. No regrets. Yeah.
Yeah, no regrets.
Get the tattoo. No regrets.
No regrets.
Thanks to Nietzsche. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
With texting Eric, he says that he is trying to restart his computer. It's just taking him a little while.
Oh, okay, for sure. So maybe we'll get him back.
Wait, so
least.
how did he mention? I actually didn't do the reading. I've been like packed as hell. But how did he mention Nietzsche's eternal recurrence into the mind, the bizarre? Dude, yeah.
Yeah, no, he didn't so much relate it to that. I finally found it. He was just saying, let's see. So the sentence that he mentions it, he only mentions it once, is just common sense might not be quite as fun as Nietzsche's eternal recurrence or Leibniz's windowless monads, or as scientifically current as insert ever-changing example, but common sense metaphysics ought to be attractive, at least to a certain portion of philosophers. So
okay.
I guess he's just trying to say it's certainly more interesting and fun to talk about these really what we perceive as abstract ideas of metaphysics. It's a lot in it. That's true. It's a lot more fun and a lot more interesting, but perhaps or scientifically for that matter, I guess maybe for the physicalists, but common sense metaphysics is definitely attractive, probably to more people for sure, right? I mean, I guess that's the reason why it's called common sense. It's quite common. But yeah, so that's the only time he mentions Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. He doesn't mention it other than that. He does a second time later mention Leibniz's windowless monads. Yeah, but
I guess I kind of see where he's going with that in terms of like these are interesting concepts, and yeah, it's just fun to think about.
Yeah,
but, like, the value in it, I'm not sure how much. In terms of value is like the validity of it. Of your immediate like comments, is like, oh, cool. But other things that might be more like valid is like this seems like bullshit, not plausible. But I guess you have to just get over the common sense portion of it and accept the bizarre.
Yeah, and like he was saying, or at least this is what I got from at one point Schwitzgebel was saying, like with just disjunctions, excuse me, saying kind of like, well, it's an either or, right? It can be let's say either the world is all physical, or there's a mind and a body and a soul that's immaterial or something. Even if one might seem more common sense than us, we certainly ought to indulge the second one slightly, at least. So even though some of these theories may be really, again, abstract or bizarre to us, they deserve our indulgence, at least for a bit. And then the thing is, it seems as though there could be in that faculty like an unlimited amount of metaphysical theories that, like, should we indulge all of them? I mean, I don't know.
Like he's willing to throw some of them out to the curb, like the 17-second soul.
Yeah.
That's why Popeye's chicken sandwich have a conscious ability.
Yeah.
Answer is yes. I killed some guy for it.
Yeah, I was curious on that point because it's, pretty obvious, like we'll have to do a bit of intellectual triage here and not give every single thing its due attention, right? But I wonder, you're going to have to presuppose a certain criterion of judgment for that. Like, what is too bizarre to permit of, serious discussion, but it seems that criterion is going to, you know, rest at a different point for everybody, right? Because for me, for example, Berkeleyan idealism is already too bizarre to even consider. But for another person, that's, you know, the line that we need to, you know, we have to toe that line, right? But anytime you're talking about, you know, like a presupposed criterion of judgment, you're going to have a certain system backing that anyway. So you're just going to throw the problem back, you know, a step further and further each time. I don't know. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just gonna
Like,
say, oh, sorry,
yeah,
sorry. I was just gonna say,
yeah,
along with, I mean, he had mentioned prior the when he was talking about the four something, saying like, well, you could think that consciousness is like in degrees, or maybe that there's an exact bright line of where consciousness stops and ends, or stops and begins. It seems similar to the bizarre idea, right? Of like, well, where does it begin to be too bizarre? Is there a degree, or is it like a bright line? Once you pass Berkeley, you're too far gone, you know, or Berkeley, however you pronounce it. And where is that line, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know. And the more I think about it, is like Schwitzgebel mentioned how like, oh, like a certain number of years ago, this seemed bizarre, but it's not bizarre anymore. So for example, I guess like 500 years ago, germ theory was like, what the fuck do you mean as germs? Microscope question mark. But like now it's like, oh yeah, you know, your 8th grade textbook.
That's
So
true. Yeah.
like how will metaphysics then grow? And like maybe then I'm thinking like, okay, either everything is just every concept is just bizarre then, and we just don't have the knowledge enough and time, or nothing's bizarre and everything's possible.
Yeah, that's true.
Since like we're able to get these amounts of knowledge that we will never know about. But what was the one meme? It was like things you know, things you don't know, things you know you don't know.
Yeah.
And the things you don't know is just like infinite, which if you ever get to know them, now they're not bizarre. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean, is that our conception of what's bizarre and what's perhaps too out of reach is based on what we know. And the
Yeah.
more that we know, as years go on, the more we know about, you know, science and the physical world, maybe something becomes more or less bizarre. But I guess again, it's all based on the physical world, which has no bearing. It's
You just get the mega supercomputer that now like measures out every atom, and it's like everything makes sense to it all of a sudden.
yeah.
But no, that's material world. Metaphysics computer.
Well, if Gerardo, since you have his number, if you want, you can always just text him that it's no biggie. We normally end at 3 anyways. He has a meeting very shortly, so I guess he'll have to get on his computer eventually. But I don't think it's a huge deal. We got enough out of him. We'll let him go. So other than that, I'll end